Here's a fact I learned recently. The electric doorbell was invented all the way back in the 1830s. We've been ringing doorbells for about 200 years. But in the past decade, technology has transformed the way we use these devices. Many of us are familiar with Amazon's Ring doorbells and other home security cameras that capture, and in some cases store, footage of people on your front step or in other areas around your home. They've exploded in popularity in recent years. Millions of people use Ring cameras. And they give some people peace of mind in the face of potential break-ins or theft. But with this popularity has come concerns about where that footage is going and what it's being used for. And a bigger question. Is it ethical to record video of your neighbors or package delivery folks in the first place? To dig into this, I spoke with Matthew Guariglia, a senior policy analyst at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, a nonprofit digital rights group. He remembers when Ring doorbells became top of mind for him. It was when he first started working at EFF in 2019.
And at the time, I was living in Brooklyn, New York, and it seemed like overnight I felt myself being watched in a way, because you'd walk past stoop after stoop after stoop, and in front of each one of these doors was a camera. And I started thinking, like, well, what does the back end look like? On the back end, could you follow me as I walked to or from work because I walked past 30 different Ring cameras in 30 different locations?
Ring's policies have evolved a lot since 2019. But still, there are big questions about how to record and use their footage responsibly. I'm Claire Duffy, and this is Terms of Service. Matthew, thanks for doing this with us.
Thank you so much for having me on the show.
And let's just sort of set the scene a little bit. What happens from a tech perspective when somebody comes to the doorstep of a home with a Ring doorbell installed? What is captured? What happens to that footage?
So what happens is it triggers a kind of motion event, and people can change the sensitivity of it. They can change the range of, where the motion is that sets off the camera. But what happens is if it senses motion, it begins to record both audio and visual. And it records it for, as long as there is motion and for a few minutes afterwards. And it stores that data on Amazon's cloud or, on a server somewhere at Amazon, depending on what your settings are.
And then you get that delivered to your phone. Like, as the user, you also get that delivered to your phone to review or...
Yeah, I think it depends on your storage setting. So on some doorbells, you can have it set so that it doesn't actually record. You can look through live. If somebody rings the doorbell, you can talk to them and see them live, but it does not record anything or store anything. With Amazon, I'm pretty sure you can set your storage limits. So you can set for how many days or hours you want it stored for. And based on how much you pay for storage, you could store every motion event for the past 6 months if you have a tremendous amount of storage, or, every 30 days it kind of wipes whatever you store.
So it's not necessarily recording all the time. It sounds like it both sort of depends on how the user has set it up and also whether it senses that there is something there to record it all.
Yeah, I mean, in that way, it's not kind of like a traditional security camera where it's not just turned on recording all the time. As far as I know, I mean, there could be settings that allow you to do that, but it would take a tremendous amount of storage to have 24 hours worth of footage, on a cloud somewhere. And that's all computing capability that you usually have to pay someone for. So
if the Ring cameras, in theory, are activated by some sort of motion, how close or far, if you're walking on the sidewalk and it's on the stoop, is that close enough that it will activate? Do we know?
It depends to some extent on the settings of the user. So you can turn sensitivity down, you can turn sensitivity way up. But if you turn sensitivity way up, every time a flag moves in the breeze or a squirrel runs by, you're going to get an alert on your phone that there's a motion event.
Why do you think that we've seen such growth in terms of the adoption of Ring cameras? There have been some fairly remarkable stories about cameras catching criminals who broke into people's homes, but is this actually having a measurable impact on crime rates or just people getting their packages stolen? Or is something else behind the growing adoption of this?
Yeah, and I think this is where we have to get into the kind of nitty-gritty reality of the situation, of what's actually driving the mass adoption of these surveillance doorbells. I think on the one hand, we see from research that fear of crime has become fully detached from the actual statistics of crime. To some extent, we are looking at a kind of reaction to the panic about crime, egged on by TikTok videos on social media, and also on police departments and by the companies themselves. There is a huge profit motive in making sure that you are buying into this current crime panic. And there's incentive for police as well, when they can just go from camera to camera to camera and get everybody's footage. So both police and these massive companies have a investment and you being bought in.
Ring has been around for more than a decade at this point. It was founded in 2012 and acquired by Amazon in February 2018. And in the years since then, Ring's relationship with police departments has changed pretty significantly.
It has changed a lot, in part because of so much pressure from communities and from civil liberties organizations. It used to be that Ring would enter into partnerships, official partnerships with police departments. And at this point, we're talking about 2018, 2019, around then. And if they joined these official partnerships, at which hundreds of police departments did, they would get a specific platform made for them by Amazon where they would be able to instantly request footage through the email accounts of Ring users. In an investigation with the Los Angeles Times, in some instances we found that police were even getting discount codes that they could go out and when they talk to somebody who oftentimes might be a victim of a crime or be concerned about crime, they could say, well, you could really use a camera on your house. Here's a discount code to buy a discounted camera. But when they used that officer's discount code, that officer got perks.
After that 2021 report, the LAPD said accepting free devices and recommending them to community members didn't run afoul of its code of ethics, but paid endorsements would. It said an initial review showed officers hadn't violated its rules. Still, Matthew says the practice raised questions for community members.
And so it became this really kind of odd thing where if you were living in a community and a police officer said you really need a camera, you could never really be sure in those years whether it was because you actually were concerned about crime and that you should take precautions in your house, or because the police department got some sort of a kickback for their relationship with Ring. And yet Ring perceived police as such a good way to spread the word that they were building kind of free tools for them. And that has changed a lot over time. After pushback, they stopped being able to send requests directly to Ring users' inbox, and then they had to just publicly post their request for footage on the Neighbors app, which was a kind of social media sort of Nextdoor style app that Ring users could use. And then after that, they announced, I think in January of 2024, that they were changing altogether and that Ring was no longer going to facilitate police requests directly to their users. That if police wanted Ring users' footage, they had to go and knock directly on their door and interact with them directly rather than go through the company.
In 2021, Ring made police requests for footage from users on the Neighbors app public in a bid for transparency. Last year, Ring again updated its policy around sharing video footage with law enforcement. Now, Ring will only provide public safety agencies like police and fire departments with video footage or customer information in the case of a life-threatening emergency, like a kidnapping or murder. Police can still also use a warrant or court order, which a judge has to sign off on, to obtain camera footage from Ring. But they can no longer request footage directly from individual users through the Neighbors app. Today, public safety agencies can share updates and ask for users' help solving crimes by posting to the Neighbors app feed and providing third-party means, like an officer's email address, where users can send video if they want to help. These changes came after years of scrutiny over how law enforcement was using information from Ring. What were users and privacy advocates really worried about?
I think people were rightly concerned, that Amazon was a company that served kind of two bosses. One being the consumers who actually sustained Ring by buying the cameras, by buying the subscriptions, by paying the monthly fees for storage. But at the same time, creating a product as usable and as useful to police as possible. And sometimes you have to ask whether or not those two purposes are at odds. Like, are you there to protect my footage and to protect my house, or are you there to create a consumer subsidized extension of police CCTV? And then there was a lot of stories of Ring employees who had been fired because they had access to the user's footage from, their own personal devices. And then there was a big controversy, I believe in 2019 or 2020, where a bunch of hackers had just stuffed a bunch of username and password combinations that had, leaked from other data breaches on the web until they found people who had reused that same username and password for their Ring camera. And they got access to a lot of people's devices, and they were shouting racial epithets at children. They were spying on people's cameras inside and outside their homes. And I think that resulted in a class action lawsuit. So there had been a kind of steady drumbeat of bad news for Ring that I think had turned a good portion of the public and civil society against the way they kind of managed and organized their data.
In 2023, Amazon agreed to pay more than $5 million to settle FTC charges over alleged Ring privacy issues, although the company said it disagreed with the claims. Currently, Ring says its security protections include things like mandatory two-step verification when you log in, and users can also opt in to end-to-end video encryption for added security.
Ring has made some good moves. They introduced end-to-end encryption. So when you turn that feature on your Amazon Ring, your data sits on Amazon's servers encrypted. So people from the company don't have access to it. It's just, you and your device that have access to that footage.
Or hackers wouldn't have access to it in that case, right?
Well, if they used your Ring and username and password, then they would still, yeah. Well, if they gained control of your account, then they still would, yes. But
right.
But if there was some kind of intercept in the middle, or they had somehow gotten access to Amazon servers from an administration side, then no, they wouldn't have access to it. So that was one big move they made. But again, it's not on by default, which is something we've been asking Ring to do for many years, is to turn end-to-end encryption on by default. But the fundamental problems of it, which is that you have a camera and a microphone aimed at public spaces like the street, the sidewalk, or even your neighbor's house. If you're in an apartment building, your hallway, which collects data on your neighbors and pedestrians and the delivery people who you rely on. And so that the fundamental problems of it still poses some serious issues.
Of course, even though Ring is the most well-known, these questions about home security cameras aren't limited to Ring. There are plenty of other players, like Google Nest, Eufy, and Arlo. Each of these have their own features and privacy settings. Coming up, what does it mean for all of us that we're in view of these cameras so much of the time, even if law enforcement isn't involved? And if you do choose to use a doorbell camera, how can you do it responsibly? That's after the break. What do you think it means for all of us that we are all being watched more often, almost everywhere we go, and that it's not just governments or law enforcement that are doing that monitoring, but consumers are also helping by buying products like this?
Yeah, I think it's fundamentally altering the way we understand what is private and what is public space. I know people who have moved personal conversations away from specific rooms of their house because it's where their security camera or their, Alexa or their Echo is sitting. So it's taking portions of our home which were understood to be private and actually making it in our minds not private spaces because there are recording devices there where we don't control that footage or that data entirely. If this was a generation ago where a security camera on your house backed up to a VCR in your garage, you could be confident that the only person who had that footage was you. And that's just fundamentally not the situation we find ourselves in now.
Sort of on that note, I think there are a lot of people who have just kind of given up on the idea of privacy. Like, they know we're being tracked on our phones, that we can be filmed almost anywhere we go, and they just don't really care. They've given up. What would you say to that argument or that feeling?
Yeah, I mean, two big things. One is, I'd say if you have given away all of your privacy and you see no negative consequences of it, then good for you. You are in a rather privileged position in life, because not everybody can say that. I mean, people who live under constant surveillance, and there are some communities and some people in America who live very much under surveillance, understand the consequences of that. You could live in a neighborhood that is just blanketed in police surveillance. And so jaywalking in some neighborhoods becomes a much more punishable offense than jaywalking in other neighborhoods that don't have as many cameras. So if you have never had a negative consequence of surveillance, you live a rather privileged existence, but there are other people who acutely know those consequences because they live under that surveillance.
Ring says it provides resources to customers on best practices for appropriate use, and offers features like privacy zones, which lets users designate certain areas within the camera's view as off-limits for recording. But still, the company ultimately says it's up to customers to use their devices responsibly. How should regular, everyday people be thinking about balancing a desire for the safety and security benefits that a home surveillance camera could provide with what we know about how that footage can be used and the concerns around surveillance?
Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, on a practical level, I would say think about what the camera is really aimed at. Is it angled in a way that it's just getting your porch and driveway? Or do you have a huge swath of your neighbor's yard, the sidewalk, the people across the street from you, their, door? So think about what it's actually looking at and think about how you could angle it in a way that it is just looking at property that you control and not filming, people in your community all the time. I would also invite people to think about the audio. I mean, we've done experiments with Consumer Reports that show that Amazon Ring microphones are much more powerful than I think people realize and capable of catching voices from much further away. So if you can reduce the sensitivity so that it's not being triggered by motion and catching so many voices maybe from your neighbor's window or from the car at the stop sign, please do so. And on a more holistic level, I would say, think about what you actually want it to serve. Because do these cameras ultimately actually prevent theft? If it really prevented theft, we would not have so much footage of people stealing packages right in front of these cameras.
Yeah, it's such a good point. I feel like that is a whole category of social media video. It's like, look at this person from my Ring camera stealing my package. I'm curious about, you brought up neighbors, and I feel like I've heard of this as an issue where people are like, I don't love that my neighbor has their Ring camera pointed at my home. Do people have rights in terms of asking their neighbors and community members to change how they're using these things?
I mean, I think that's part of the issue is not quite. I mean, be diplomatic, talk to your neighbor about it. If you have to send them some good privacy literature, EFF has plenty of it.
Send them this podcast.
Yeah. But no, I mean, I think you have to be diplomatic about it, and you have to think of yourselves as a community, that safety and privacy are both kind of team sports, and that, are you looking for the safety of your own house? Or are you thinking about the safety of your community in general? Because if so, you really should be thinking about it as a team. And I really encourage people to work with their neighbors and make sure that you've come to accommodations that make everybody feel comfortable.
Are there more privacy protecting home surveillance, home security options than maybe Amazon Ring is?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is something you have to look for because there are so many out there. But I think, everybody has their own specifications they're looking for. I would look for, who has access to the footage. One thing I would definitely consider looking for is ones that store locally. So the footage isn't stored on a server somewhere controlled by the company, but I've seen some that have like a hard drive that you plug in that is connected to your camera, and all the footage it collects is stored on that hard drive locally, and you have control over it. And the idea is to try to look for products that get as closely to the old VCR in the garage as you can, so that it backs up to something that you can control, and if anybody wants access to it, they've got to come and knock on your door to get it.
Well, Matthew, thanks so much.
Thank you so much for having me. This is a great conversation.
So, to recap, here are some things to consider if you have a Ring doorbell or any doorbell camera, or want to install one. First, pay attention to where your camera is pointed and consider adjusting your sensitivity settings so that it's only picking up what you really need in order to feel safe. Think about how much footage you're recording and storing in the first place, and adjust your settings if you need to. Next, if you're on the market for a home security camera, consider one that stores locally on the device, rather than uploading to a cloud where you have less control over what happens to that data. Third, if you feel comfortable, talk to your neighbors about a collective approach to safety. That's it for this week's episode of Terms of Service. I'm Claire Duffy. Talk to you next week. Terms of Service is a CNN Audio and Goat Rodeo production. This show is produced and hosted by me, Claire Duffy. At Goat Rodeo, the lead producer is Rebecca Seidel, and the executive producers are Megan Nadolski and Ian Enright. At CNN, Matt Martinez is our senior producer, and Dan DeZula is our technical director. Haley Thomas is senior producer of development. Steve Lichtai is the executive producer of CNN Audio. With support from Kira Daring, Emily Williams, Taylor Phillips, David Rind, Dan Bloom, Robert Mathers, James Andrus, Nicole Pesaru, Alex Manaseri, Lainey Steinhardt, John Dianora, and Lisa Namaro. Special thanks to Katie Hinman, David Goldman, and Wendy Brundage. Thank you for listening.